Hello, and thanks for downloading the Scottish History Podcast. In this episode, it's just going to be me, Chris. I'm flying solo. Peter couldn't make it for the recording, but we always try to get one out per month. So we're gonna roll this one out as a SHP Chris edition. So yeah, we hope that's cool. Okay, so in this episode, we're going to have a look at the Scottish mercenary. Mercenaries have been used for thousands of years throughout the world as a source of professional soldiers. There are records of Scots entering the mercenary trade from as far back as the 1200s, and especially across the 1600s, a time seen as a golden age of mercenary employment in Europe. Overall, the idea here is to approach an appreciation of the changing significance of the mercenary profession in Scotland, and the various ways in which people found themselves serving as mercenaries among the multitude of armies and sovereigns of Europe. First, we'll offer a definition of a mercenary. A mercenary is a person who fights for a cause he isn't personally committed to for pay. But in the research, and while talking with friends about this episode, we came across a spectrum. So on the one extreme, there's the pirate and the outlaw. They're not part of the mercenary range since they fight for their own cause, instead of a wider shared goal also held by their employer. Then moving towards the center of the definition of a mercenary, there's the person who fights for pay in a cause they themselves are not committed to. That's kind of like the purest form of a definition. This might include a Scots officer who served for the Tsar of Russia in the 1600s. Moving beyond that, you get the person who actually shares the cause of the group who also pays them to fight. Examples of this are Scots who fought in the Dutch Wars of Independence, known at times as helping troops by the Dutch, as opposed to other regiments mentioned in Dutch sources called rented troops. And more recently, there's the Scot fighting in the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, and they went to Spain in defense of the Spanish Republic. So there's this balance between fighting for pay and fighting because you share common cause with your employer. We're adopting the broadest definition of the Scots mercenary. If you're rolling out abroad to fight for pay in a foreign army, you're a mercenary. The history about Scots mercenaries is built out of some interesting stuff. At the top of the list are diaries by men who directly experienced careers as mercenaries in the 1600s. There's surviving contemporary media, things like a pamphlet called The Swedish Intelligencer, which kept the public up to date with the wars of religion in the German region, a theater of war through the 1600s in which tens of thousands of Scots would serve in. There's also a correspondence by the Scots Privy Council, which related to the raising of mercenary regiments, and that was a kind of government committee of the 1600s. In a sense, this episode is about an extinct Scottish industry, the mercenary economy in Scotland. At one time, Scotland was a major exporter of professional fighters, as individuals and as entire regiments numbering in the thousands. One source of demand for mercenaries was the myriad of issues that came up with the traditional method of raising armies in the medieval period, calling out the feudal levy. The feudal levy was a military force assembled out of the peasants of a given region and led by the local aristocracy. We used the analogy of a Facebook invitation in the Castles episode, with the king inviting his nobles to a battle and the nobles in turn inviting the peasantry. Drawing the peasantry off the land was a pricey strategy. They were the tool for cultivating the land and moving any kind of economic output. The levy wouldn't always be too happy with traveling far abroad either, and even if they were committed to distance, the typical call-out in medieval Scotland was for 40 days, and that could only get you so far on an offensive campaign. Then there's the matter of skill. Men were required to train and arm themselves and attend events known as weapon showings, at which their military equipment would be assessed. This was like an MOT on every serving age man, or a required DMV visit if you're in the US. So if you didn't want to deprive the land of workers, risk angering a settled population, and depend on time-constrained, relatively inexperienced troops, then you could make recourse to the mercenary. The disadvantages of feudal armies in terms of motivation and cost created a space for military specialists to develop. For guys who gave up plowing and committed to make a living working in the security business, at least for a stint. Some societies developed an industry of war and made complex use of their quote-unquote mercenary stock as a lever of public policy. Switzerland through the 1500s is a famous example in the literature. They exported thousands of troops known for their phalanx formation, and the trade itself was a vital part of the Swiss economy. The German Landsknecht is another example. I've probably pronounced that incorrectly. Apologies for that. This was a category of mercenary trooper common in the 15 and 1600s. These guys streamed out of their home regions into a list of hiring armies and cities which could rival the number of professional European football teams available for joining today. Another example is an interesting phrase used to describe a cohort of Irish mercenaries known as the Wild Geese. These guys found themselves as mercenaries as much of the native Irish establishment were muscled out by invasions from England in the 1500s and the 1600s. Thousands of former Irish aristocrats found themselves joining European royal courts and armies as mercenaries and advisors because of this. Mercenaries were usually exceedingly expensive. On top of this, mercenaries could be unreliable, difficult to handle, and sometimes averse to fight. Think about it this way. If you're getting paid to fight and the fighting ends, you're out of the job. So the longer you can prolong the fighting, the more money you get. Another way of getting more money would be to have, air quotes, invisible soldiers on the books. So your regiment might have 500 troops, but on the relevant documents you put 520 troops, and this means there's an additional 20 paychecks from your employer. In Scotland, the mercenary path presented both opportunities for some and challenges for others. In the 1600s, some worked abroad as individuals. They might be hired as officers to work in European armies, or they might simply, there are examples of people simply winging it, taking a boat to Poland and just seeing what will happen. Most joined the mercenary economy through the regiments that were assembled in Scotland. For some, the prospect of fighting abroad for the King of Poland or Sweden or Denmark was a solid business opportunity. Scots officers abroad could obtain a commission from foreign sovereigns to recruit thousands of Scots to their upcoming wars. The Scots government was aware of the trade and made efforts to reduce the free flow of Scottish mercenaries to continental war zones in the 1600s. And they were not always successful. There are examples in the literature of illegal mercenary regiments being formed just out of the population. A recruiter would show up from, Sweden, Denmark, wherever. He would have X amount of money granted to him by his employer, and he would hire X amount of Scots, and they would do so without a license from the government, and they would get their guys together, get on a boat, and then head out to the war zone. And this is the kind of thing that the Scots government was trying to get in control of that process. But yeah, there were examples of people just doing it illegally. An interesting angle in terms of the government interacting with the mercenary economy shows up in the records of dispatches to lairds that shows a self-conscious effort to use the mercenary trade as a kind of crude jobs and skills policy. Lairds and boroughs would be encouraged to direct, at times forcefully, the unemployed, the indebted, and the jail-bound into the ranks of mercenary regiments destined for European battlefields. But one thing in particular, I think, which is really interesting and worth highlighting, is that in the 17th century, the mercenary experience in Scotland was absolutely relevant to most people. You would know people who were serving as mercenaries abroad. The prospects of conflict opening up in the various places around Europe, and stories from the various fronts must have been ubiquitous. And researchers found that during the 30 Years' War, which was between 1618 and 1648, around 50,000 Scots served in the melee between a range of contending European armies. And as a proportion of that generation, that would have been about 20% of serving age males of that generation, and that's like 1 in 5 guys between 1618 and 1648 on the continent as mercenaries. So if you had like a pie chart of kind of like where people are working, where they're getting their income from, you would have agriculture, and there'd be a little bit of manufacturing going on there, and there'd be a good chunk dedicated to the military, to the mercenary trade. So a lot of people are being drawn into the military economy of Europe across the first half of the 1600s. Why are people joining? Most people who found themselves in a regiment were poor, but the Scottish mercenary attracted people from across the wealth span. We've created 3 avatars to represent those who went abroad as soldiers for hire. First off, we have the northeastern aristocrat's third son. For him, the job was a tool of social mobility, or at least social stability. He's not the firstborn son, so he can't inherit the family property, so he'll have to figure something else out in a world before tech startups. His aristocratic values won't square with taking a job as a weaver or a farm worker. Within the values of his position, military enterprise was an occupation that offered the prospect of respect from his peers, and self-esteem. A 17th century contemporary, Robert Gordon of Strathlock, described how those raised in aristocratic culture in the northeast of Scotland considered regular work, quote, unsuitable to their birth, end quote. And because of these values, many ended up being poor. He continues, quote, to alleviate which they addressed themselves to the profession of arms, end quote. An interesting product of this aristocratic attitude of certain jobs being below one's station are these things called birth briefs. And birth briefs were a sort of CV. They were a kind of resume that aristocrats or the sons of aristocrats could bring with them when they entered the mercenary trade of Europe. So you might get some guy from Scotland who's of an aristocratic background. You know, he shows up to the commander of a Polish army who's hiring mercenaries, and he shows him this certificate saying that my family is very important back home. They've achieved a lot. I have a very, robust lineage. I should be given an appropriate position within your army. Next up are those guys who entered the mercenary profession not exactly from a position of strength. This is the unemployed man, the vagrant, the debtor. One way a person down on his luck can end up fighting in the middle of Germany as part of a mercenary regiment was the policy-making of the Scots government of the day. In April 1627, the government recommended that certain nobles could forcibly recruit all, quote, strong and sturdy beggars and vagabonds, idle and masterless men wanting trades and competent means to live upon, and who in that respect are unprofitable burdens to the country, end quote. If you had to make the choice between crushing poverty or long jail time, you might be making the right decision taking a swing at making a career out of fighting. I reckon the largest proportion of the tens of thousands of guys who enlisted to fight in Europe during the 1600s did so with the hope of making a living. When you first enlisted, you'd be given an upfront payment, sometimes known as the King's Shilling. The upfront payment could be a make or break amount for a poor family or an indebted individual. The choice between starving at home and putting your life at risk, fighting for money, was no choice at all, really. Simply put, being part of a mercenary regiment could mean a stable income. The final type we suggest is the adventurer, a person who signed up for the thrill and the potential of making something of themselves, beyond whatever bland career was laid out for them in Scotland. In the 1600s, a martial culture existed right across Europe, with notions of personal honor, courage, and strength being common currency. This attitude is shown up often in our reading of the Scots' experience as mercenaries. So as an example, it's 1621, and John Seton, a Scot, is in the service of King Frederick, a German Protestant leader at war with the Holy Roman Empire. Seton was charged with defending a castle for his employer. In time, he would find himself and his troops under siege in the fortress. An enemy emissary arrives with word that a nearby castle has already fallen, and he suggests in his correspondence that Seton should surrender. Seton replied, quote, my dear sir, I have received from bugleman Antonio Banzio your estimable letter, in which you inform me that Tabor has returned to obedience to his imperial majesty, and request that I do the same. I am unhappy that a place such as Tabor, which so bravely defended itself against your forces, was obliged to surrender. And I may also say that the defenders conducted themselves with valor. It is my wish to conduct myself in a like manner, and since I have promised my king my loyalty unto death, my only course, if I do not wish to deserve the name of liar, is to declare that, as a testimony to my loyalty, I wager my life on the struggle, awaiting whatever war may bring. End quote. So there's this idea of the mercenary trade being a path for glory. It's not always a bread and butter affair. At times, an almost casual or theatrical attitude to war appears. An example for this, McKay's regiment, and this is a regiment of Scots from the north of Scotland, and they found themselves campaigning in the north of Germany. And there's this moment when the regiment is in formation against an army from the Holy Roman Empire, and in among the ranks of the Holy Roman Empire is a Scot. Many of the armies during the 30 Years' War were highly cosmopolitan, so it's like 30%, German, 30% Swedish, 20% Scottish, and then on the other side it would be like 30% Spanish, 30% Italian, 30% German. These armies were very highly cosmopolitan. And so there's this regiment from the north of Scotland arrayed against the Holy Roman Empire. And then out of the ranks, or among the ranks of the Holy Roman Empire, comes this insult, and it's this Scottish guy, and he says to the guys in McKay's regiment, quote, "Have with you, gentlemen. Think not now you are on the streets of Edinburgh pervading," end quote. And so there's almost like this sportsmanlike quality to the fighting. There's this sort of, the word is cavalier, so it sounds like Three Musketeers. And there's this kind of martial culture that people around Europe they're being drawn in to these battlefields. So yeah, you might join because you're broke, you need some money, you need a job, but there is also that kind of be all you can be element to it that is relevant to these guys. There's that kind of adventure element to it. And that quote, the guy jesting from the Holy Roman Empire's ranks, that's from a diary by a guy called Robert Monroe, who we're going to talk about more later on. Some of the writing by Scots mercenaries is downright practical, at least a mile away from the desperate debtor joining for the sake of the king's shilling. James Keith was a 20-something Jacobite exile in Paris. He ended up in Paris after the expulsion of King James II of England and 7th of Scotland during the Glorious Revolution in 1688. While in Paris, he was a student, and as students do, he found himself procrastinating from his main goal, to serve in a European army as an officer. We have his own explanation for why he put off making applications for getting hired as a foreign officer. Quote, "But I was then too much in love to think of quitting Paris, and though shame and my friends forced me to take some steps towards it, yet I managed it so slowly that I set out only in the end of the year, and had not my mistress and I quarrelled, and that other affairs came to concern me more than the conquest of Sicily did, it's probable I had lost many years of my time to very little purpose, so much I was taken up with my passions." End quote. And so there's this guy in Paris studying as an undergraduate, and he's like, I need to make my applications, to these various European courts and armies to find a commission to, get my military career going. And he's procrastinating because he's busy hanging out with his girlfriend. So we have an idea of why people are recruiting mercenaries and why people might be willing to take up the job. Demand for Scottish mercenaries migrated to wherever conflict was breaking out in Europe. The typical venues for Scots mercenaries were in Northern Europe: France, Ireland, the German states, and the Baltic. The list of cases to look at is vast. Across the 1600s, there are the Dutch Wars of Independence, the 30 Years' War, conflict between Sweden and Russia, between Russia and Poland, between Poland and Sweden, and more often than not, with Scots being on both sides to varying weights simultaneously. The earliest documentary evidence for Scottish soldiers fighting overseas is the Galloglass. These are men who served in the armies of the various kings of 13th century Ireland. The first record of the Galloglass at work is from 1259. An Irish prince, Aeth O'Connor of Connaught, received a dowry of 160 of these Scots warriors from the daughter of the King of the Hebrides. In return for their military service, Galloglass received land and titles from the Irish kings that allowed them to settle. They could also receive their pay in kind, as they were entitled to supplies from the local population. By 1512, there were around 59 cohorts of Galloglass operating throughout the country in the service of the Irish nobility. Some sources suggest that the Galloglass were armed with a two-handed Sparth axe, and this was a throwback to the soldiers' Norse heritage. The northwestern islands of Scotland, they used to be part of a Norwegian authority. Norwegian Vikings came over and annexed the territory. They wore a chainmail shirt over a padded jacket, topped off with an iron helmet. And there's also a suggestion that individual Galloglass could have personal assistants. And this would be two boys who operated much like the way a squire does to a knight. So they would accompany him, and one would carry a supply of throwing spears, while the other would carry various provisions. And there's a mention of the Galloglass in Shakespeare. He mentions them in his play Macbeth. Quote, "The merciless MacDonald, worthy to be a rebel, for to that the multiplying villainies of nature swarm upon him from western isles, of kerns and Galloglasses supplied." End quote. So from that, I gather that there's this guy called MacDonald in Shakespeare suggesting that he's rebelled, and as a result of that, he's going to have to deal with the Galloglass, these medieval Scots mercenaries. Crossing the North Sea in the opposite direction from Ireland towards Germany, many Scots signed up to regiments, shipping out to join the numerous and cosmopolitan armies slugging it out in the 30 Years' War. That was a conflict centered on the German states, which drew in people from all around Europe. Among these regiments was McKay's regiment, raised in the north of Scotland in 1626 for service to the King of Denmark. The regiment was drawn together from across society. Farming tenants and the sons of lairds joined the force. It was part entrepreneurial venture and part military aid to allies in the 30 Years' War. Sir Donald McKay of Strathnaver was the key decision-maker of the district, a place north of Inverness. The government recommended to him that a regiment could be put together for service in Germany, saying, quote, "You have a number of idle men in your boundaries, who lie loitering at home, and might be more profitably employed, both for the credit of the country and their own, by tying them up in military discipline." End quote. In only about 2 months, 3,600 guys had been recruited. Among them was Robert Monroe, and it's through his first-hand accounts that we know so much about the regiment he served in. Quote, "Those worthy cavaliers, whereof some, from mean condition, have risen to supreme honor, wealth, and dignity. If you ask, why I wrote these observations, it was because I love my comrades. If why I published them, no, it was for my friends, and not for the world, for which I care not, nor for any that is ungreat." End quote. The regiment came together and sailed for Germany to get established within the Protestant armies which had combined to fight the Catholic Habsburg Empire. Monroe describes a range of challenges, things like logistics and strained relations with allies. At one point, the regiment finds itself as a core part of the garrison in the northern German city of Stralsund. Danes, Swedes, and Scots reinforced the city to replenish the losses suffered from bombardment and assaults on the city walls. By the end of the siege, 500 of the 900-man detachment from McKay's regiment had lost their lives defending the city, alongside other reinforcing Scots regiments who had endured similar losses. But the defenders were successful, and the siege was lifted. Soon afterwards, Denmark had had enough of the war, establishing peace with the empire, and ending the regiment's contract. And as Monroe wrote, quote, "Free from our honorable master, we were ready to embrace new conditions from a new master." End quote. From here the regiment was replenished with new recruits from Scotland, and new contracts were drawn up to enter employment with the Kingdom of Sweden, as Monroe decided to do, or as others decided, to end their time fighting in Europe and return home to Scotland. And so within that story of McKay's regiment, them coming together north of Inverness, sailing over to Germany and taking part in that siege in Stralsund, and there are all kinds of different stories. So you get, the laird's son who's doing that as a means of a worthwhile career, the guy who joins because he's broke, and then there's the government encouraging the local aristocracy to bring together all these guys so that they can take part in the 30 Years' War. And there's a hint of the adventure of it. These are guys who they could have just spent their entire lives in the north of Scotland being farmers, but they got together, went over to Germany, and by the end of the war they had to make this decision. Do I sign a contract with the King of Sweden? Do I go to Poland? Or maybe I just call it a day and go back home to Scotland? And that's it. That's the episode. I hope you enjoyed that. We both work on the script together. There's the way we build the episode. There's like notes that we follow, that we work on leading up to recording day. Peter isn't here in person, but he's definitely here in spirit through the notes. And so I'll go through the books. First up here we've got Swords for Hire, The Scottish Mercenary, and that's by a guy called James Miller. Definitely, if you want to explore the Scottish Mercenary, like, this is basically the book to get. You could get it on Amazon. It wouldn't be that dear. That's where you can learn more about Robert Monroe and McKay's regiment. And then next up, there's A Military History of Scotland. We mentioned that in the previous episode on castles, and that's edited by Edward M. Spears, among others. It's one of those books that's made out of there's 15, 20 authors. They all contribute their own chapter to creating the book. And the relevant section that we looked at is titled Mercenaries, The Scottish Soldier in Foreign Service, 1568 to 1860, and that's by a guy called Alan Carswell, and it's a great chapter. It was a lot of fun to read. And then we got a book called Bayonets for Hire, Mercenaries at War, 1550 through 1789, and that's by a guy called William Urban. That wasn't about Scottish mercenaries specifically, it was just about the mercenary trade generally. And another book also by William Urban, but this one deals with medieval mercenaries. It's called Medieval Mercenaries, The Business of War. Again, just a general mercenaries one, not about Scotland in particular. Definitely check out those 4 books if you get a chance. You can get in touch with us at scottishhistorypodcast@gmail.com, and we're on Facebook and on Twitter. For our next episode, we're doing research on a man called John Knox. So yeah, we look forward to releasing that next month. All the best.